ready to dive deep. Today's topic is heavy, for sure, but really important, I think. How is evil restrained in the world? A listener sent us this sermon, How God Restrains Evil in the World, and wow, there's a lot to unpack.
It's a really unique perspective, how different forces might be at work to keep, order and goodness in society.
Yeah, for sure. And it just jumps right in, No beating around the bush. The sermon just comes right out and says it. Everyone is a sinner. And the evidence, death. We all face it, right? Even babies. And the sermon suggests, well, they haven't exactly done anything wrong, have they? It's this idea of inherited sin, like passed down from, Adam and Eve. Whoa. What do you think about that? This idea of universal sin?
It's a pretty central idea in lots of theological traditions, actually. The idea that human nature is, fallen. And that's, at the root of evil and suffering in the world.
Okay, so we're all, flawed, prone to sin, as this sermon puts it. So what's stopping the world from, just completely falling apart?
That's where the sermon gets really interesting. It makes a bold claim. Humans. We're the most dangerous force on earth, capable of, immense evil. And there's this one quote, kind of chilling. The deadliest force in the world is not nature. The most dangerous and deadly force is humans.
Wow. Okay, that's a lot to process. Why us, though? Why are we considered the most dangerous? Because we can, plan, strategize how to, inflict harm on each other.
That's a big part of it, yeah. Animals are mostly driven by instinct, but we have this higher level of consciousness. We can plan, invent, build. But sometimes, that creativity is turned towards destruction. On a scale nature nature can't match.
Right. Okay, so if we've all got this potential for chaos lurking inside us, how do we keep things from, falling apart? What's the antidote to all this potential for bad?
Well, this sermon suggests God has put in place 4 restraints, safeguards almost, to, mitigate evil and keep some kind of order. Yep. It's a framework for understanding how, even with all our flaws, goodness can still exist,
Okay, I'm hooked. Tell me more. What are these 4 restraints?
Conscience, family, civil authority, and the church.
So just to recap for our listeners, we're talking about this idea that everyone's, prone to sin, but there are these 4 things keeping it all in check. Our own conscience, family, the authorities that govern us, and the church. Ready to dive into each one?
Absolutely. Let's start with conscience. The sermon uses this really interesting analogy comparing conscience to pain. Moral pain, that is. Just like physical pain tells us something's wrong, our conscience, it tells us when we've messed up ethically. It's that feeling in your gut, that you're doing something wrong.
Well, yeah, like a built-in alarm system. Goes off when you step out of line. Right. But some people's alarms seem, louder than others. Why do you think the sermon says some consciences are weaker?
It suggests they can be, distorted, muffled even, by changing morals and, a rejection of guilt, maybe. What if society starts calling wrong things right? Our internal compass gets all messed up. You ever notice that happening, around us?
All the time. It feels like what's considered okay is changing constantly. Things that used to be, totally unacceptable are now celebrated. It's like we're being told to ignore that inner voice.
The sermon also mentions this trend of rejecting guilt. You hear messages about, not letting guilt control you, embracing your true self no matter what. But what if your true self wants to do bad things?
You've got a point there. It's where's the line between accepting yourself and just, letting yourself off the hook for bad behavior? Okay, so that's conscience. What about family? How does that fit into all of this?
This sermon is very clear. The family is the building block of society. And it really emphasizes the traditional model. One man, one woman, married, raising kids together. That's where, ideally moral instruction begins.
So it sounds like the sermon sees a very specific family structure as, essential. And anything outside that model is, a crack in the foundation. It even says that God hates divorce, and not just because of the pain it causes people, but because of the effect on society as a whole. That's a strong statement.
Yeah, it is. To illustrate how important family is for, shaping character, it points to Deuteronomy 6. Parents are supposed to constantly teach their kids God's laws. It's about passing down a moral framework. What about you? How did your family shape your understanding of right and wrong?
Oh, my family was huge. My parents were big on instilling values, honesty, kindness, treating people right, all that stuff. It definitely formed the basis of how I see the world. Okay, so we've got the inner voice, the conscience, and then family, the first line of moral instruction. What about the third restraint? Civil authority.
This one's interesting. The sermon claims the primary duty of those in authority is the moral well-being of citizens. And get this, it suggests that responsibility, it extends globally. It even says, a nation that knows about deadly crime and fails to do what it can has shirked its duty.
Whoa. So it's not just about keeping order within a country, but like intervening when bad stuff happens anywhere in the world. That's a pretty broad view of authority.
And it gets even more, thought-provoking. It calls police officers ministers of God, because of their role in restraining evil. I know that can be interpreted in a lot of different ways, especially now with all the conversations about law enforcement, but it highlights how important their responsibility is.
Yeah. It really makes you think about their purpose, doesn't it? It's not just enforcing the law, but maybe like upholding a moral order. Okay, so we've got the inner voice, the guidance from family, and then the external authority of the law. What about the last one, the church? How does it fit in?
The church, according to this sermon, it offers something unique, something the other restraints can't. It offers, internal transformation through the gospel. It's not just about outward behavior, It's about hearts changing from the inside out, becoming, as the sermon puts it, new creations, addressing the root of the problem, that, inherent sinfulness we talked about earlier.
So, like, your conscience might tell you something's wrong, but the church offers a path to actually change your desires, change your very nature.
Exactly. And it's not just an idea either. The speaker mentions people who come to his church after, getting out of prison, looking for a fresh start, a new way of life. It's about faith's power to, actually change lives. And through that, restraining evil from within. What do you think about that spiritual transformation as, a force for good?
It's fascinating. If people can truly change their desires, well, it makes sense their actions would follow, wouldn't they? But it's not easy, right? Like flipping a switch.
Definitely not. But the sermon argues it's a key part of the equation if we're serious about, truly combating evil in the world. So just to sum up, we've got these 4 restraints: conscience, family, the authorities, and the church, each working in its own way to hold back all the bad stuff. But I'm sensing there's a but coming.
You're reading my mind. The sermon, it expresses some concern that all 4 of these restraints, they're under attack in today's world.
Welcome back. So we've been talking about these 4 restraints on evil, right? Conscience, family, civil authority, and the church. And it's kind of striking how they all, work together, like they depend on each other.
Yeah, totally. It's not just a list. It's more like a whole system. And it got me thinking, these ideas, they didn't just appear out of nowhere, right? What about like the historical context?
Oh, absolutely. These ideas, they go way back, woven into like Western thought for centuries. Take conscience, for example. You can trace it back to ancient Greece. Socrates, Plato, they were all about, knowing yourself, moral reasoning. Even back then, they knew that inner voice, that pull towards what's right. Super important.
So that inner compass, people have been talking about it forever. What about the others? Family, civil authority, the church. Did those ideas develop over time too?
For sure. When Christianity started spreading, through the Roman Empire, it emphasized family as like this sacred thing, super important for raising kids with faith and morals. It reinforced this idea that family, it's like a frontline defense against, unchecked sin.
It's amazing how these ideas have been around for so long, shaping how we see things.
Yeah. And we can't forget about civil authority. This sermon, it leans heavily on Romans 13, which was written, when the Roman Empire was famous for its laws, its ability to maintain order over like huge distances.
So even back then, they knew they needed laws, some way to keep things from, devolving into chaos. It sounds like the sermon is saying that even a bad government or a flawed one is better than no government at all when it comes to, restraining evil. Do you think that's right?
I think it's more nuanced than that. It's not saying like any government is good. It's not condoning tyranny or anything, but it acknowledges that some kind of structure, law and order, that's crucial for a stable society.
Yeah, it's like that balance between individual freedom and, the need for rules that everyone follows, a classic dilemma. What about the church? When did it start being seen as like this force for restraining evil?
Early Christianity, it spread really fast, partly because it offered hope, forgiveness, transformation. This idea that faith could change you from the inside out, that resonated with people. And as the church grew, it became more influential, shaping moral values, providing support. Think about the monastic orders, dedicating their lives to prayer, serving others, teaching morals.
So the church wasn't just about like personal spirituality. It was also like a moral compass for society.
Exactly. We provided a different way of looking at things, emphasizing love, compassion, selflessness, in a world that's often driven by, well, pretty different things. But this sermon, it seems worried that the influence of these restraints, all of them, it's fading. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, that's the big question, right? We've talked about the historical roots, but the sermon seems to be, I don't know, sounding an alarm. What's changed?
Well, one thing it points to is secularism, less religious belief, a rejection of traditional morals. You don't see as much emphasis on religion in public life these days.
It's true. It feels like religion has become more of a private thing, and there's less of a, I don't know, a shared moral code based on those beliefs.
Right. And this shift towards secularism, it's kind of created a moral vacuum, hasn't it? People are figuring out their own values without like a strong external framework.
Which can be good and bad, I guess. You have the freedom to choose your own path, but also you could get lost without a compass,
Exactly. The sermon also points to the rise of individualism, the focus on personal freedom. Sometimes that comes at the expense of like obligations to society or communal values.
Like that me first mentality, which can lead to, I don't know, disregarding other people's well-being or the needs of the community.
Right. That focus on the individual, it can clash with what's good for the group. And then there's relativism, this idea that there's no absolute truth, no universal moral standards.
So if everything is relative, how do you even talk about like good and evil? How do we agree on what needs restraining?
That's the tough part. The sermon seems to suggest that all this moral ambiguity, it makes it easier to, well, justify doing bad things. If there's no ultimate right or wrong, people can just appeal to their own beliefs, even if those beliefs are, harmful.
It's like the line between good and bad gets all blurry, which makes it easier to, I don't know, excuse bad behavior. And that impacts each of the restraints, doesn't it?
Yeah, for sure. As those lines blur, conscience, it becomes less effective. Families, they struggle to provide a clear moral compass. Civil authority, well, people challenge its legitimacy. And the church, its message, it loses its power to speak to a world that's questioning everything.
So it's not just that these restraints are under attack, it's like the very foundation they're built on, it's shifting. That's a sobering thought.
It is, but it's a conversation we need to have, understanding these historical forces, and the challenges they bring. That's important if we want a society where good can actually, thrive.
Okay, so we've talked about the historical context, how these restraints are connected, and the things that are, I don't know, eroding them. But how is this all playing out in real life? Let's get specific. How are these restraints, working or maybe not working in today's world?
Well, let's start with conscience. This sermon, it argues that when people try to redefine right and wrong, it's basically attacking the foundation of, morality itself.
Can you give some examples? Like, how is conscience being, I don't know, manipulated?
Think about the debates around abortion, euthanasia. The people who are for these things, they often argue that they're morally okay, good even, because they promote, individual choice. But others, they say these acts are just plain wrong. No matter what, they violate the sanctity of life. That clash, well, shows how easily conscience can be used to, justify actions that were once, like, universally condemned.
Yeah. It's almost like conscience becomes a shield, doesn't it? Protecting us from feeling bad about choices that could be, I don't know, really harmful.
Exactly. And this manipulative conscience, it's not just limited to those big issues. Think about like how casual sex is more accepted or infidelity. Stuff that used to be taboo is now framed as, liberating, empowering, even when it can cause, pain and brokenness.
It's like the message is, do what feels good, don't sweat the consequences. But what happens when those consequences, catch up?
That's the scary part. When we ignore our conscience or twist it to fit what we want, we open the door to, well, all kinds of destructive stuff.
And it's not just individuals who suffer, is it? This erosion of conscience, it impacts everyone.
It does. A weak conscience. It affects families, too.
Yeah.
They rely on a shared understanding of right and wrong. We see this in divorce rates, more single parents, people living together without being married. It all points to, moving away from the traditional family structure, the one this sermon sees as so important.
Yeah, it feels like family, this basic unit of society, it's losing its ability to, I don't know, lay that strong moral foundation for kids.
And that has a ripple effect. Kids who grow up without that stable family, they're statistically more likely to struggle. In school, emotionally, behaviorally, it's like each weakened restraint, it weakens the others, this like downward spiral.
Okay, so we've talked about conscience and family. What about civil authority? How is that being challenged these days?
Oh, we see it all the time. Disrespect for law enforcement, people questioning the justice system, less civic engagement, people are protesting police brutality, debating criminal justice reform, expressing distrust of, government institutions.
It's tough, right? We need to hold those in power accountable. But the sermon also seems to be saying, be careful about dismantling the very structures that are there to, protect us.
Yeah, it's about finding that balance between pushing for positive change and maintaining, a system of law and order that actually works. Without that, as this sermon says, you get chaos.
It's a tightrope walk. We need reform, but we also need those, guardrails.
Okay.
Last one, the church. How's it doing in all of this?
The sermon, it expresses concern about false teachings within the church, people becoming apathetic, and this growing disconnect between the church and, the culture around it.
Like a crisis of relevance, almost. A lot of religious groups are struggling with this feeling that the church, it's losing its voice. It's not speaking to, the needs of a modern world.
It's a real concern. When the church doesn't, uphold truth, offer real guidance, model love and compassion, it loses its authority, its power to change hearts. It becomes just another institution, competing for attention.
So it's not about clinging to old traditions. It's about actually living out those core principles in a way that, makes sense to people today. That's a tough job.
It is. And it's a challenge the church needs to face, if it wants to remain a force for good in a world that's becoming more secular and individualistic.
This has been a true deep dive. We've explored these 4 restraints on evil conscience, family, civil authority, the church, and how they're being challenged. But where does it all lead? What happens if, things keep going in this direction? What are the consequences? That's what we'll be talking about in our final segment. Welcome back. It's been quite a deep dive into the restraints on evil, hasn't it? We've talked about how conscience gets twisted, the pressures on families, civil authority being questioned, and even the church struggling to, keep up with the times.
Yeah, a lot to think about for sure. It can be kind of overwhelming.
Yeah.
But remembering that, understanding the problem, that's the first step towards fixing it.
It's true. But before we jump to solutions, I think we got to face the big question. What if we don't find those solutions? What happens if these restraints just, keep eroding? The sermon, it didn't sugarcoat this, did it?
Nope. It was pretty blunt. If these restraints keep weakening, it could lead to, nihilism. And that's not just some, abstract philosophy thing. It has real consequences.
We mentioned nihilism earlier, but what does that actually look like? A society steeped in nihilism? What are the, warning signs?
Imagine a world where people have lost, their sense of purpose. No shared beliefs, no agreed upon morals. Everyone just looking out for themselves, driven by, their own desires, power grabs. Truth becomes subjective, meaning is impossible to find, and life itself feels, pointless.
Wow. That's a bleak picture. Chaos and despair. Are we really headed there? Is the sermon being, a bit dramatic, or are these real possibilities?
It's tough to, predict the future. But history shows us what happens when societies lose their moral compass. Things fall apart. The French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, the Rwandan genocide. Even in modern times, we're not immune to the darkness that can tear us apart.
Chilling examples. Makes you realize even with all our progress, we're still susceptible to the same, forces that have been around forever.
Oh, exactly. It's easy to dismiss those warnings, I think they're exaggerating. But I think it's important to, take them seriously. The sermon's asking us to think about the consequences of our choices, individual choices, and as a society, to be proactive, recognize the danger of, just sitting back and doing nothing, and actively work towards a world where good can, win out.
Okay, so what can we do? If we see these restraints weakening all around us, how do we push back? How do we, avoid that slide into nihilism?
Well, the sermon doesn't give us a, step-by-step guide. But it does offer some insights. It emphasizes personal responsibility. Each person looking at their own heart, living according to their conscience, striving for, integrity and purpose.
So it starts with looking inward, taking responsibility for our own choices, trying to live by our values.
That's the foundation. And from there, we can start to, rebuild stronger families, better communities, restore trust in those institutions that are supposed to serve us.
But it can't just be individuals working on themselves, right? It's got to be a group effort.
Absolutely. It takes a village. This sermon talks about supporting families, encouraging respect for the law, having open conversations about our values. It's about a renewed sense of responsibility, a willingness to, work together, a commitment to building a better society, a more just and compassionate one.
That's a big challenge, especially when the world feels so, divided.
It is. But we can't ignore it, can we? Not if we want to leave a good world for our kids and their kids. And even amidst all the challenges, I think it's important to remember, hope's not lost. Even when things are dark, there's, something bigger than ourselves that can bring healing, change things for the better.
That's a good point. The restraints might be weakening, but they haven't vanished. And we all have a role to play in, making them strong again.
We've covered a lot in this deep dive, explored how evil is restrained in the world and what might happen if those restraints fail. It's heavy stuff, no easy answers.
It's definitely given us a lot to think about, but I think more than anything, it's a call to action. It's asking us to look at our own lives, our communities, the world with a critical eye and ask ourselves, what can we do to make things better?
That's the question, isn't it? The choice is ours. Cynicism or, stepping up, working together to rebuild those restraints.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it's, equipped you to engage with these important conversations and make a difference. Until next time.